look after the other occupations in the town areas. So largely the peasantry were largely neglected. The plantation workers, as we know, were also neglected. And largely in the kampong areas and in the plantations, they were under some kind of feudal domination. And this was one way to keep them separate. While the Chinese and the Indians and the Malays as well in the urban areas, for example, there were the Malays in the Central Railway stations. There were Malays in the coal mining areas of this country. Indians, of course, were also in railway, in the electricity board, etc. That was the way in which the colonial power divided and ruled this country. And one of the biggest factors that led to the emergency was the strength of the workers' movement. And the workers' movement in the 40s, you'll find the works of Stenson very important. You'll be surprised that many of these professors who were talking a lot recently, they are not the experts on these areas. I will name the experts of these areas as I read them. The workers' movement was so strong that by 1947, membership of the Pan-Malayan General Labour Union exceeded 260,000, and that is more than half the total labour force in this country. And you compare today, you know how many percent of the labour force in Malaysia are unionized? Less than 10%. And the labour unions are all broken up. They were broken up during the emergency. The laws that we have in this country were brought into existence from the emergency. The way in which unions were registered, etc., the way in which societies had to be registered, have their origins in the colonial era. Okay, so today, you try to register Party Socialist Malaysia, you have a great deal of trouble trying to do that. SUARAM had a great deal of trouble trying to register itself. Even Hakam, the human rights organization that was sponsored by Tunku Abdul Rahman and Hussein On, had problems registering for 2 years. They all came into view during the emergency. And the waves of strikes during that time, you have to read Stenson to appreciate, but I can read that in my book as well. The casualties during the emergency and compared it to the casualties in World War II. Total insurgents killed nearly 7,000. Total security forces killed nearly 4,000. Total civilians killed nearly 2,500. Total killed 13,000. And how many people were killed during World War II? More than 100,000. And talking about history and professors again, Anthony Short was a lecturer in Malay University during the time. He was commissioned by the Malaysian government to do a history of the emergency between 1948 to 1960. Today you can read it in a book called The Communist Insurrection in Malaya, a very big book. But this is a government commissioned work that was rejected by the Malayan government. Can you imagine that? What is history all about? Whose history are we talking about? You know, why was it rejected? And if you're going to read, because as an academic and a lecturer like Dr. Asmi Sharon, he's honest. He writes as he thought. He wrote as he knew the figures and the facts. He was given access to government documents, etc. And he wrote as he saw it. But that kind of work is not good enough for the government, and it is banned. And it was rejected. The number of people who were detained, banished, and new-villaged, I say new-villaged, you know, as if it's a verb, during the emergency. And these figures were actually at the beginning of the emergency. In 1948, as many as 4,500 were arrested, 2,700 detained, new village, 500,000 was something like 20% of the Chinese population in this country. At the time, at the independence, the population of the Chinese in this country was something like 2 million, 2.5 million. 500,000 is a hell of a lot of a number, okay? And at the time, when the emergency first started, there were as many as 1,000 Malays detained. But that was, if you read my book from the declassified documents from the British Public Records Office, they wanted to hush it up. Because the emergency had to be portrayed as a Chinese insurrection. That is the way in which communalism is part of the strategy of the colonial power and the way in which they made sure that the people who took control in this country were in their interest. So from my book and from the records, you find that they were not just considering the British interest, they were considering the whole Western imperialist interest during the emergency. Because the emergency, if you remember, before the Vietnam War, was the biggest anti-insurrection war in the world. I think I've got the figures to show the relative forces that in existence. And you also remember that the emergency was declared by the British in June 1948, whereas the Communist Party of Malaya, which was actually caught off guard, only declared the insurrection in December 1948. And so what we're told today about how the emergency was a communist insurrection, as if it was a very communist-inspired kind of insurrection, is actually not a very true picture of the way it started. Well, that is what I wanted you to see. The Malayan National Liberation Army had regulars of 10,000, British Commonwealth Forces 40,000, Armed Police 70,000, and the Home Guard, which is the equivalent of today's RELA, 300,000. And it was the biggest, and that quote you can see from Pomeroy, including aircraft, artillery, perhaps the biggest force ever used against the colonials during the colonial period. And as I've said often enough, with May 13, with the emergency, with World War II, we really need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country for there to be closure. I'm sure I don't know if you're following the news about the massacre of Batang Kali, where some 23 or 24 people were killed at Batang Kali by the British during the emergency. And they're still asking for compensation now. And the House of Commons, recently the courts just allowed a judicial review of the people who asked from Batang Kali who are calling for a judicial review. And this is a very interesting case that's coming up. And the British were trying to say, oh, it's a very long, it's already very old. We can't open a case like that. Which is not really true, because the Mau Mau insurrection in Kenya is even older than our emergency. And they have succeeded in asking for compensation from the British government. And to understand the anti-colonial movement, I won't repeat what my Saudara Banchen said earlier on about the way in which the Malayan Union was compromised by the British. The Malayan Union was actually a document to ensure that there was civil equality for all Malayans at independence. But of course, they saw that the UMNO and the Malayan aristocracy was a better horse to back for the British. And so they negotiated with the Malay rulers and UMNO behind the backs of all the others in this country. At that time, including even the big bosses in the Indian and Malay community, Indian and Chinese community, you'd be surprised. So that at one time, the Chinese Chambers of Commerce was also with the All Malaya Council of Joint Action, like Saudara Lee Banchen said. Tan Cheng Lock, the founder of MCA, was the chairman of AMCJA. So you see, at the time, if you understand history of Malaya at the time, you'll be very surprised how we have slightly changed, you know.